with Neogen. Well, let me see if I can try and get my camera on. There we go. Before I was with Neogen, I did pest control for about 10 years here in central Illinois is where I live. And store product pests, that was kind of my specialty, kind of my forte. I dealt with it every day and I got pretty good with it. So your store product pests, it's also called pantry pests. For anybody who doesn't work with it, it's a pretty specialized unit. So if you do work with it, you probably work with it quite a bit. And throughout this presentation, I'm just going to be going over just the entry level type of things when it comes to your stored product pests. We're going to talk about first why it's important to know about stored product pests and why it's relevant to us in our job. We're going to learn how to identify your most common ones that you're going to see out in the field. We're going to talk about some different characteristics, and why they'd be important, if they're in your facility, why you'd want to know that they're there, how you'd inspect for it, monitor it, and then lastly, we'll talk about some different treatment options that you can do if you find them inside of one of your facilities. Firstly, kind of want to just talk about how much damage stored product pests do every single year. About roughly 10% of the world's annual food supply is damaged by stored product pests. If we're talking about just the global crop production, before all of your product gets harvested out of your fields, it's about 40% will get lost in between plant pests, mainly your stored product pests. Majority of it will probably be your weevils. You can see the weevil here on the very far left. But here's just some of the damage that your stored product pests can do. Your weevil here on the far left, it can kind of eat your kernel from the inside out, and after it's all done, it can kind of turn it into a little bit dust, and that's how, your weevils will destroy your product. Or here in the middle, you have cigarette beetle damage on top of your dog food, and just kind of how that looks like, these perfectly drilled holes. Kind of look like someone took a buckshot shotgun into, your dog food. And that's what that damage would look like. And then here on the far right, just be Indian meal moth larvae going into some almonds. To kick out with your identification, this is your Indian meal moth. I call her the queen of your stored product pests, the one that your technicians will be seeing the most often. She's about 3/4 of an inch long as an adult. And you really get to tell what these guys look like because of their little two-tone wings. They have rusty brown and bronze wings tips, and you can see on here. Something pretty interesting about your Indian meal moths is when they are adults, they don't feed. So when they become adults, their only priority is to try and find a mate and reproduce. And they're only going to be alive for about 14 days. About 10 to 14 days is the average of, your adult Indian meal moth. They won't be feeding on your product or anything because they don't feed. But instead, what they do as far as damaging your product, it's an indirect damage. And it's the way that they attach their silk webbing to the product, or at least the adults. The larva can eat all your products, your stored products, and most of your pantry foods. And then that's kind of how it is with most of your stored product pests, is where the adults is what you're looking for, but the larva is what's really going to be doing the damage. Your Indian meal moths, they can attach all their eggs to a silk. And if you can see closely, you can see all the larvae kind of squirming around. This is actually birdseed that I had left unattended for about a month inside my house. So this can come up pretty quickly. But you can kind of see in this top picture how they have that silk webbing kind of lined throughout that whole bird feed. That's going to cause a huge moisture issue with any kind of bulk ingredient that you have in a facility. If you have a farmer that has a warehouse and they have products sitting out there for a few years and it's infested with Indian meal moth, you're going to see that looks like a white film over that product to where you can almost peel it back. It's pretty gnarly looking and pretty gross. But if you get it to where it's that bad, moisture issues definitely going to be a huge issue with your Indian meal moths. One thing that Indian meal moths get mistaken for quite a bit is your Mediterranean flower moths. These two moths they're not as well known as your Indian meal moths, but you do see them in a lot of different settings. Both of these moths are very prevalent inside flour mills, food mills, different bakeries, and so that's where they're going to be, kind of hanging out at. Your Mediterranean flower moth, it's roughly around the same size as your Indian meal moth. They can get a little bit larger. They're going to be pale gray in color. They do kind of have that two-tone look to them, which is why they can get misidentified as Indian meal moths quite a bit. If you have old Indian meal moths on a glue board, they can kind of get dusty a little bit, and they'll look almost exactly like a Mediterranean flower moth. Uh, so one of the things about your Mediterranean flower moth, if you do want to try and differentiate them, from your other store product pests, is you can actually pull their wings apart and you'll see some like little black markings that kind of look like little eyes a bit. That'd be one way that you'd be able to tell, if you're dealing with Mediterranean flower moth. Your Angoumois grain moth, it's pronounced kind of like it's French. It's Angoumois grain moth. The adults are only about a half an inch thick or half an inch big, so they're a little bit smaller than some of your other moths. And they're going to be a little pale grayish brown in color. They're going to look a lot differently than your Mediterranean flower moth and your Indian meal moth, uh, mainly because they're going to look more kind of like a closed moth. They have like these feathery appearance to their wings, and you might be able to tell from the picture, but if you zoom in, you can kind of see on the bottom here, it kind of has a little feathery appearance on the bottom of their wings. And so one thing these feathery wings can do one of the same things as your Indian meal moths, and it's cause a moisture problem. If you get a lot of Angoumois grain moths in one spot, you can get their body heat moving up enough to where it can create some condensation and some moisture issues and start to erode away on your product. But all three of these moths are very important to know. And it's something that if you do any kind of food processing facility, audited facility, a place that works with food or bulk ingredients, these three moths you definitely need to be looking out for. I'd called the Indian meal moth the queen of the stored product pests. I like to call the rice weevil your king. He's going to do your most damage, your weevils. They take care of, now I just seen a study on this. I don't know how true it is, but I have to look at it. But about 75 to 80% of your stored product pest damage is due to weevils. There's a lot of things that contribute to why that is. One of them is your rice weevil. They're only about 7 millimeters long, about the same as your granary weevil. They're the same in size. Your rice weevil is going to be a dullish red to brown and black in color, and you'll be able to tell your rice weevil because it's going to have 4 light red to yellow markings on its back, which you can see here. Your granary weevil, it's going to be like a shinier reddish brown to black in color. The older they get, the darker they can get. But it'll almost look like it's speckling if you're seeing it, and as a technician out in the field, just because they do have that shiny-ish reddish color to them. Your weevil, what they do is they're going to use that little nose they have there, and they're going to puncture a hole on the inside of your corn and bean kernels, just your seed, and you can kind of see the holes there. And you're not going to see the eggs or the larva. You'll probably never really see the eggs or larva of your weevil. And the reason why is because they deposit that egg right in the middle of that kernel. When that egg hatches, it's got all the food and shelter that it needs until it reaches adulthood and then makes another hole and comes outside, of that kernel. So because of that, if you have any kind of issues with your weevils, you might not even know about it, or you most likely won't know about it until they've all hatched and done all their damage. Your rice weevil is able to fly, and they are attracted to light. And so in the summer on the outside, your rice weevil can start infesting a lot of the fields, and they can actually fly from field to field, if they have enough time to do so. Your granary weevil, they cannot fly and they are not attracted to light. They are also very tolerant to colder weather. Your rice weevil is not. So if you start to get some freezing temperatures, a lot of your rice weevil will just die off naturally because it's getting cold. Your granary weevil, however, they're a lot more tolerant to the colder weather. So if you get a bunch of them together, they can generate a lot of body heat to where they can survive, them winters. Last place I used to work at had this little fish tank, and they'd have stored product pests in the fish tank. And in the winter here in Illinois, it can get pretty cold. That fish tank would sit out in our warehouse, and when it got really cold outside, you could see, all the granary weevil kind of congregating in the middle. And it was incredibly impressive how much body heat that they actually generated to where you could put your hand, over the little mass that they're forming, and feel the body heat. Like it's really impressive. And because of that, they can survive outside and in cold weather, throughout the winter. Next two we'll discuss today is your red flower beetle and your confused flower beetle. So these two are going to be roughly around the same size uh, as your weevils. They're going to look completely different from your weevils. Your red and confused flower beetle, they look almost identical. They act the same and they eat the same and have the same habits. Now, even though that's true, it's very, very important to be able to distinguish one versus the other. One of the biggest reasons why is if you're doing any kind of treatments for stirred product pests. Your stirred product pests are going to have different fumigation levels, or what your CT counts for treatments will be depending on your different insects. Your flower beetles, for instance, your red flower beetle is going to take some of the higher CTs to kill all stages of your insect. Your confused flower beetle, not so much. If you do a full-fledged fumigation at a confused flower beetle CT rate, you might kill some adults of your red flower beetle, but you're not going to touch any, larvae or eggs. So if you do that, you really have to get your identification correctly, or you might be spending a hefty amount of money doing any kind of re-fumigation or retreatment to try and correct anything missed. Red flower beetles, reddish brown in color, and you confuse flower beetles the same. If you are going to try and distinguish them by color, don't. So if you have a picture of both of them right next to each other and you're looking at one in the field and you say, well, the confused flower beetle is a darker red on my guide than it is, so, and that I'm seeing from the naked eye, so it must be a red flower beetle. That's not a good way to identify the two. Depending on what they're eating, how much water they have, how old they are will determine if their body color can be like a darker red or a darker brown. So going off the color is not a good identification practice for stored product pests as far as like, red versus red. Your red flower beetle does have the ability to fly. I personally have never seen them fly out in the field. That doesn't mean that they can't do it. They're known to fly only under extreme duress. So this would be, if it's in the field in a corn bin, it's 100 degrees outside. That inside that bin is going to be a lot hotter than 100 degrees. And you might see some red flower beetles taking flight. Or if it gets extremely overpopulated, then they might, try and fly to a different spot. But, hearing that, like trying to look at if they can fly or not, you won't be able to tell. Like if you take a handful of flower beetles, toss it in the air, if they don't fly, you can't say like, no, must be a confused flower beetle. You know, with the red flower beetle, they have the ability to fly, although you'll probably never ever see them do that. Your confused flower beetles, you know, just in comparison, they can't fly. The main things to try and identify them, the difference is their antenna. Now, it's really hard to see in these pictures, but the last three segments on the antenna on the red flower beetle is going to be enlarged. And you'll see this with a lot of different store product pests where the last three segments are going to be larger than all the others. Your confused flower beetle, the antenna will gradually expand towards the end, and you're not going to see the three elongated towards the end. Just kind of taking a closer look at the antenna, you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. And then here on the confused flower beetle on the right, you can see where it kind of gradually gets larger as it gets more towards the end. I'm going to talk a little bit about some hard-shelled beetles, or some more hard-shelled beetles that you can see out in the field. These you probably see a little bit more often than some of your flower beetles. It's your cigarette beetle and your drugstore beetle. They're both roughly about the same size, to 2 to 3 millimeters long. Your cigarette beetle is going to be a reddish yellow or a brownish red in color. And if you were to take a flashlight and shine it up next to it, they can kind of glow like an orangish color, kind of like a little tiny light bulb. It's kind of cool. Your drugstore beetles, they don't do that, you know, so they're not going to have that glow to them. So your cigarettes, you can kind of see that their wing covers are not striated, and they have that flat back here in this picture. You can see it kind of creates a little shine to it. So, I mean, that's one thing that your cigarette beetles have. Their heads are going to be bent down at a nearly 90-degree angle. So if you have an ILT, you are going to be catching cigarette beetles and drugstore beetles. But if you do have an insect light trap, or just a pheromone for that matter, when you're looking at your cigarette beetles, you're probably not going to be seeing their head. Looking at from up top, it's just going to be it's just going to be, you know, like a 90-degree angle looking down. So you're just going to see, you know, that second portion right here. You won't see the head, which is why I have the two pictures of them here. They have a serrated antenna, and so does your drugstore beetle. But your cigarette beetle, kind of like that last three elongated ends with your red flower beetle, you know, it's just going to be, sorry, I said that wrong. Just kind of like how your confused flower beetle, how they get bigger gradually as you get towards the end. That's going to be kind of like your cigarette beetle, whereas your drugstore beetle is going to have your three elongated serrated ends on their antenna. Your drugstore beetles, they're going to look a lot hairier. They have grooves present on their wing pads, and you can kind of see that here, but it kind of gives them like a hairy appearance. So if you are looking at them, you know, they can look, sometimes they can just look dusty, you know, versus hairy. One thing I would tell my technicians while they're in the field, one way to distinguish the two, or just something to help you remember it, is that cigarettes are smooth and drugs are groovy. And that was the saying that I would always tell my technicians, and they would always remember that. So, you know, if they have the groovy on the back pads, you can tell that it's the drugstore beetle. They've got that flat back and it's nice and smooth. It's going to be your cigarette beetles. Kind of a closer here about the differences in them. You can see the antenna on your cigarette beetle. It's going to be serrated, but it's going to be the same here. Whereas your drugstore beetle, it's just going to have your three elongated serrated edges here for the drugstore. And then your wing pads, you know, your smooth cigarettes and your groovy drugs here. So your warehouse beetle, this one's actually getting more and more prevalent. And I noticed in the past, you know, 7 or 8 years, the warehouse beetle is coming up a lot more frequently. Just in the past 3 or 4 years, I know here in the Midwest, they've kind of exploded a little bit. They're about twice the size of your cigarette beetle and your drugstore beetle, about 4 to 6 millimeters long. They're going to have dark and light patterns present on their wing pads, as you can see here. I would always, or my technicians would tell me that you could see the W for warehouse beetle on their back, and that's how they would kind of remember the warehouse beetle. Don't get this confused with a carpet beetle, because a carpet beetle can look the same. The larva looks pretty similar, but they're gonna have more of like a scaled pattern to their back. If you have a warehouse beetle and a carpet beetle, side by side, you'd be able to tell the difference pretty good. But if you're not aware of the warehouse beetle and it's your first time out in an account, these get mistaken as carpet beetle all the time. They are excellent flyers, and they're very highly attracted to light. They can live outside, and in some areas geographically, they're going to be more prevalent on the outside than they are in. One thing that they will feed on is like dry vegetation. So if you have a lot of vegetation outside of an account and you have a dry spell, it's where you get 2 weeks of no rain, it's just nice and dry out. Warehouse beetles are going to thrive. They're going to be flying like crazy, having a good old time. If you get any kind of rain, then the activity outside just kind of stops. I'd found when it gets rainy outside, a lot of your stored product pests won't fly around. And that's also the case when you hit about 55 degrees. Almost all of your stored product pests, if it hits about 55 degrees inside of your facilities, you're going to stop seeing the flyers, right? They'll still be walking around, but they won't be getting around your facility as much via flight. So keep that in mind. Your warehouse beetles, they're not going to be feeding on your product. They're not going to have any kind of secondary damage, done to, your products. Where the danger in warehouse beetles lies is in their larvae. They're going to be out of sight, out of mind in those areas, kind of up in the rafters, the dusty areas. If you have an old mezzanine, or a storage area, above an office spot, that's where your warehouse beetles are going to be hanging out at. Their larva, as you can see in the picture, has thousands and thousands of these setae hair all around it. And when they shed that last larval skin, that casing is super fragile. You can get a very light breeze and blow one of these casings into your product stream, and that's where the dangers of your warehouse beetle get to. Even though this larva is crazy tiny, and these hairs are crazy tiny, it's been known, to affect, animals as large as a horse. I've heard, if it gets into like a baby food or anything like a toddler product, you can have a lot of bad issues, happening from that. I've seen places have to shut down because of warehouse beetles before. This picture on the very bottom right, that's actually my forearm. I used to service this food facility back in the day, and they had a real bad warehouse beetle problem. There's this little mezzanine that I had to crawl back in like this little 2 foot gap. And when I got out of there, I had found a ton of warehouse beetle activity. But on my way home and for the next, 1 to 2 days, I had this half-inch raised little red platform you can see on my left forearm, and it stayed there for a while. And I'm not someone who reacts a lot to insects, and so when I saw that, I was pretty surprised at how much I can react from a warehouse beetle larva, versus something else like getting stung by a wasp or something where I don't react as much. Your sawtooth grain beetle and your merchant grain beetle, probably not going to see these as often as some of your other stored product pests in your facility. But if you do get them, they can be a pain. They're going to be a lot smaller, probably about the same size, or half the size as like your flower beetles, about the same length, as like your some of your fungus beetles, that you would see. So they're going to be a lot smaller, about 2.5 to 4 millimeters long. They'll be brown in color, and your merchant grain beetles, they'll typically be more darker brown. But if you remember me talking before about trying to pit them up side by side and going off of color, This is a great example of what I'm referring to where your sawtooth grain beetle, it's brown, and your merchant grain beetle will typically be a little bit darker brown. But, if your sawtooth grain beetle, and given the factors, can be a darker brown than your merchant grain beetle, in the different situations. They'll each have 6 saw-like teeth on the sides of their thorax. You can see in here just the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they're gonna have 12 altogether on their whole body. Your sawtooth grain beetle is flightless and they are not attracted to the light, whereas your merchant grain beetle, they can fly and they are attracted to the light. The easiest way to identify which one's which, honestly, is to try and get an insect light trap. Otherwise, you're going to have to take one of these insects, probably back with you to the office to have a closer look at it. If you have a jeweler's loop, something to where you can get a better look at it on the field, it can still be hard to try and tell the difference between the two. So if you do have an insect light trap and you're catching these guys, you're going to be looking at your merchant grain beetle just because your sawtooth grain beetle can't fly. So that's one good way to tell the difference. The other way is you have to look at the eyes, which makes it very, very difficult. The distance between the eyes of a sawtooth grain beetle and the back of its head is about 3/4 of the length of its eye. Whereas your merchant grain beetle, it's going to be about 1/4 of the distance of the length of its eye. And that's because your merchant grain beetles, they have a lot larger eyes. And let me show you what I'm meaning here. But you can kind of see the eye from here to here. So the distance from here to here is about 3/4 of the length of the eye. Since your merchant grain beetle has much larger eyes, the distance from here to here is about 1/4 of the length of the eye. So that's the little amount that we're going off of to try and differentiate the two, as far as visually identifying them. So it's very easy to misidentify your stored product pests just because they look very similar to a lot of other insects that we didn't talk about in this presentation. And also looking very similar to, some of their brothers and sisters in the stored product pest realm. So. Importance of education. I like to throw this slide in here with stored product pests because if you are working with stored product pests, on a weekly basis, you're probably going to be at some kind of food facility or some kind of audited facility, some place that requires you to be there quite a bit. And that's also going to require you as a technician to be a lot more involved. So a lot of technicians that deal with stored product pests are helping customers come up with IPM plans, threshold management plans, sanitation schedules. They are helping with all of that stuff, or most likely helping with all of that stuff. There are stored product pests everywhere, and one thing that I realized after I started working with them every day is that you can find stored product pests in just about any type of account. It's just the places that you're looking usually is as a technician aren't going to be the spots that you would usually look for, for stored product pests. Other aspects of education with stored product pests that I like to preach are some different preventative measures that you can offer. You can offer classes for identification and knowing what to look for. This is a perfect secondary service for any company to give out to any of their customers that might have stored product pests. I used to offer classes to the people on the dock team, at every single place I service. So that way they would know what stored product pests look like. They would know what their damage looks like when they're unloading it from the truck. They're not going to take an infested product and, carpet bomb your facility just by putting that, inside of its shelves. Instead, they'd be able to say, this has stored products on it. We want to reject this load and not, further risk any of our product. So inspecting all of your incoming goods, that's a very important thing. You should be doing that even when it's not stored product pests, like even your restaurants bringing in, some buggy ingredients. It's the same kind of thing, with German roaches. You should be inspecting all of your incoming goods for these things. Third product pests is no different. Setting a sanitation schedule, but then also making sure it's being adhered to. Us as technicians, we have to have that documentation, that, hey, this needs to be clean. On the sanitation schedule, it says that this gets cleaned every day, but I can tell you it doesn't. Make sure that that's being noted on the reports. It's part of our job to make sure that our contact knows these spots aren't getting cleaned. And sanitation is a huge issue with store product pests. They go hand in hand. So some going on with your inspections, what are some of the things that I'm looking for? When I'm going on my everyday journey or while I'm walking my trap line, what kind of things should I be aware of in my head? You should be looking at different machines. A lot of these machines is going to be the epicenter of an issue, and that's going to be where a problem starts, right? That's the epicenter. And so the machines are going to be what you need to be checking at, your harborage areas. Grain bins, if you're in any kind of agriculture or a food facility, they're probably going to have bulk ingredient bins somewhere in that facility. That's going to be a good hot spot. Those don't get checked too often. And instead, they're going to get checked once, I don't know, every few days or so, depending on how much they fill it or not. Bulk ingredients, commodities, a lot of times these can get shoved in a storage room and forgotten about until they need it again. Go in there, be curious. You definitely have to be curious as a technician, and if you're dealing with store product pests, you need to be curious and go into these places that you don't usually go into because that's where they'll be at. If you have any dead equipment, that's a huge thing to look at. It's a big red flag. A lot of facilities won't take dead equipment out because they want to make sure that, hey, if we start running that product line again, we have the equipment for it, or it's going to cost $75,000 to take out this piece of equipment. Let's not do it and just kind of monitor it to where that piece of equipment can be the cause of multiple fumigations, or multiple treatments, just because they don't want to spend the money to take it out. All of these type of things are spots that would be harborage areas that you need to be inspecting. Look for insect trails. Different store product pests will be leaving different kinds of trails. It's no different if you're hunting wild game in the forest, or in like the trees. You're looking at the different tracks of what you're hunting. It can kind of be the same, with your insect trails, to where your different store product pests will make different insect trails. If you do see any trails, then you're going to be close to a harborage area. You're most likely going to be close to a harborage area. And you can also tell how current an issue is, just depending on the sanitation. That's just kind of a footnote there. Look for spilled product. Look for broken machines that are causing a leak. Look for facilities that have any kind of condensation issues, broken leaky pipes, any product. If you find infested product, look at the product next to it. Just simply saying this bunk of product was infested. Let's throw this away and pay no attention to the products next to it. Make sure you're looking at it. So, I mean, you'd be surprised at how often something that simple will get mixed. Your toolbox, right? What should you always have on you when you're inspecting for stored product pests? Obviously, you're going to want a lot more than these as a technician and you're out in the field. These are 5 things that I feel for stored product pests, right? If it's for just my technician out in the field, I'm going to have a bigger list. But for stored product pests, I think these are your 5 most important ones. First one is your flashlight. See, I always said you're not doing pest control unless you have a flashlight. It's your best friend. And then your flash inspection mirror. This is a tool that doesn't typically get used too often out in the field. Your flash inspection mirror, that's the picture there in the bottom. It's like an extendo looking selfie stick type of thing, but at the end, it's a little mirror. So that way you can, look at it, you extend it, you can use your flashlight to look on top of equipment. You can look on the bottom of equipment. It's a very helpful tool. Main reason I say that this is something you have to have on you is because an auditor, that's like an auditor's number one tool. If you have somebody performing an audit, I can almost guarantee that they'll have a flash inspection mirror in their pocket. And in my eyes, if that's what like you're trying to, as a technician, have that auditor not find any problems. That's one of your main goals. You know, to have an audit that's free of any points getting taken off on your stuff, right? Use the same tools as your auditor is going to use to try and limit, you know, from him from finding stuff. A jeweler's loop or something similar. This is just so you can try and magnify the insect that you find out in the field. You know, you can help identify it a lot easier. Sample containers, whether this is on your persons as you're, you know, going out and looking, or if it's just sitting in your glove compartment in your truck, sample containers always come in handy, and you're gonna have to, you know, like that. Going back to the sawtooth and merchant grain beetles, you're probably gonna need to bring one back. You know, that one time you don't have sample containers is when you run into it on the field, and then you're stuck using the Ziploc baggie or something trying to catch your bugs and bring them back to identify even further. Your multi-purpose tool, this is just simply a screwdriver, a scraper. You're going to be dealing with a lot of glue boards with stored product pests. So you need something to scrape the bugs off the glue boards, you know, or try and get in and off or in and out of equipment like your ILTs. So those 5 tools are something that I always said you need to have on your persons when you're dealing with stored product pests, or at least in your toolbox. Some commonly missed areas when you are searching for stored product pests: trash bins, mops, and brooms. These types of things, they seem like no-brainers at what you should be looking at. But if you're a technician and you don't really know any better, you just walk right past a trash bin, you know, and have it out of your mind saying, yeah, that's going in the dumpster. I don't need to worry about it. That should be the first place that you're looking at. Look inside your trash cans and your bins. You can see here in the corner in this picture, they kind of all together. It's right out there in the open to where you don't need anything except, you know, the naked eye to see. Your mops and brooms. This is also a very good tip. If you have a room that's infested with stored product pests, just go over to the nearest mop and broom, the last one they used, and shake it. A lot of times you'll get some adult stored product pests falling off your mops and brooms, and you'll be able to identify it that way, or at least be able to say, there's something going on in this room that I need to find. It's the same thing with vacuums. If you can open up a vacuum and take a look inside, you know, do that. So, I mean, it'd be a good a spot to take a look at, you know, or inspect. Machine guards. This is a big one. They serve a purpose. You know, they protect people, but they can also create a conducive condition at the same time. Here in the picture, this is just like a little box that sits at the end of a conveyor. Now, this conveyor, whenever it would get to the end of it, would drop a little bit of dust, you know, corn dust in the bottom of that little bin, and it had this rubber flap that would go over it. And a lot of the cleaners didn't even really know that that box existed. That little area got infested all the time. How do you fix this? There's a few things to take note here. You need to maintain a regular sanitation schedule. And I'm going to go even further into sanitation, into this specific problem. One thing that this facility used to do is they would use an air hose to try and clean equipment. And while using an air hose is going to get all the dust out of there, you know, and it will successfully do that, it's also going to blow any eggs, adult larva that's in there all over the room. And so while you did clean that one machine, you potentially infested all the other machines around you in that area. So try not to use an air hose when you're cleaning any kind of equipment. Try and see if there's a more kind of sanitation friendly engineering solution. What we ended up doing in this instance, like this little front guard, we just made it removable, so that way you can take it off and then sweep the product into a bucket and then put it back on. And that's what we ended up doing. And it worked out so much better. Just little tiny fixes like that throughout the facility can go a long way with you, with your customer and just also with the activity that you'll be seeing, in general. Look for your insect trails. These are from red and confused flower beetles. They just look like little squiggly lines all over the place, right? They look like they're confused. Now, that's not how they got their name, confused flower beetles, but it does kind of go together with it and can kind of help you remember that these type of trails would be like your red and confused flower beetle type of trails. It's mostly going to be at the legs of your equipment. So look at the legging of it. It's probably where your trails will most likely be. So keep looking in those areas. I talked about dead equipment here on the far left. This piece of equipment in this facility was a cause for multiple emergency fumigations. And this equipment would have costed, over 75,000 to get taken out of this particular facility. So instead, they're like, we can't take this out because it costs too much up front. Ended up having to say, over the course of 3 years, this is how much you spent in fumigations just from this one equipment. And I was able to have them get it out of the facility, and it'll pay for itself down the road. So try and find ways, if you have dead equipment, put it to the customer to where they can find value in that solution. And they'll be a lot more willing to work with you, on that type of stuff. A lot of the facilities with your big machines are gonna have some kind of inspection hatch, right? This was a facility that had tons and tons of pipes going through, to where one pipe can go through 3 stories if it needed to. There's going to be a spot where they have, you can go in with this product. A lot of times this spot is going to be the same spot where a lab technician will go in and test the product to see if it's, bad with nutrients or whatever. This can be the same things that you're looking at for pest control. Pulling this little hatch off, a lot of times you'll see product just falling on the ground. If it's buggy, you're going to have some bugs in there. This picture here on the far right, it's kind of hard to tell, but these are all little flower beetles, and all of these little squigglies is because of flower beetles. If this wasn't buggy, this would just be flat. You wouldn't see any lines. So these type of things, feel free to open it up if you can, at your facility. I don't know a facility, or I never service a facility that doesn't care if you do these type of things, but they do care if you open up like a bucket elevator, so don't do that. You're open up the equipment completely, but these little inspection hatches, a lot of times they don't care, and they say, yeah, absolutely. This is my drink of water slide. I want you to take a look at this, or these 2 pictures. The one on the top right is just more blown up picture of the top part. There's 3 big issues going on in this picture, in these pictures right now. And this was a spot that people would walk under constantly. So I'll give you, 5 to 10 seconds to look at this picture and try and find 3 things that you may have found wrong or are red flags. So in this picture, you can see food, water, and shelter that Serb Product Pest would be able to get. You can see right here, kind of blown up. These are little moisture marks and water issues. So you need barely any water for a Serb Product Pest to be happy. A lot of them don't even need a water source. They'll get the water from the food that they eat, so they necessarily wouldn't even need it. On top of here, you can see like a 1/2 inch of product just sitting on top. If you do have any kind of fogging kind of treatment, and you are treating this facility right here in the picture, Any of your store product pests can bury themselves inside of this product to escape a fogging treatment, and they're not going to die from it. If it's a fumigation, it's a different story because that fumigant will be able to penetrate this product. But with the fogging, that isn't going to be suspended into the air long enough, for it to really get inside that product and to kill, all your store product pests. So I mean, this is a biggie. And they also had shelter right here. And so, oops. So this was like an air vent, and before this was just a metal flashing, when I had found the issue. But red flower beetles were in here like crazy, just absolutely chocked full. But you can still see some of the insulation that they weren't completely able to get until the next shutdown in this facility. But food, water, and shelter right here, a big micro environment right above the workers' heads that they didn't even know about that was going on every single day. So your contact asks you, says, I want you to monitor for store product pests. They have a facility that has 5 or 6 bunks high. You're not going to be able to inspect all that. They got pro boxes that are stacked up and collapse, and you're not going to be able to look inside all of them. Or you just have an empty warehouse. How are you as a technician going to be inspecting for stored product pests in these scenarios? There's really only one way. It's going to be your pheromone monitors. Tons of benefits with pheromone monitors. With stored product pests, pheromones are huge. It's one of the only ways that you're going to be able to monitor, them. It's going to help you detect the problem before it begins. It'll lure the insect to it. Can monitor large areas, monitor the population, verify treatments or data. So, I mean, these are all, say these two right here, these are hanging pheromones, and these were actually placed outside of this account. These are all warehouse beetles. Warehouse beetles are actually starting to get a lot more prevalent on the outside. And that's because they've kind of evolved in the past, 10 or 15 years, where the female warehouse beetles, they're actually getting a thicker, fattier tissue on the outside of their body, so that way they can actually survive the winters. And so winters in the Midwest can get pretty harsh. And even with these winters, you can still get activity like this, come spring, just because they've survived. One thing to note is that pheromone monitors are not a treatment. First and foremost, 9 times out of 10, your pheromone is going to be a sex pheromone. So you are only going to be attracting males. So at best, in a perfect world, you're only going to be able to capture half of your stored product pests out there. Now, they say that anywhere from 5 to 10% of the population can get or will usually get caught on your pheromone traps. Now this is outside, and it's obviously going to have a lot larger area than a warehouse, but you can kind of get a ballpark estimate of your customer and say, I found 10 insects on this pheromone monitor. There's probably roughly 50 to 100 in this warehouse, and just get a ballpark estimate in there. As far as verifying your treatments or data, this is good for if you have pheromone monitors. 1 week, you do a treatment, you can set new pheromones out that following week and say, yeah, we didn't catch anything this week. Last week we caught 10, so we know that the treatment was effective. That's another good aspect of your pheromone monitors. All your pheromones will be different, tons of different kinds of pheromones. These are bullet lures. This is like a pantry gel. This is going to be more of an aggregative food pheromone. So this would be more for your crawling pests or for your stored product pests that respond better to an aggregative pheromone versus your sex pheromone. They also have like the little rubber stopper, like those kind of lures. Each one is going to have a different length of how long you'd want to use it for, and how long you should switch it out. The distance that your lures should be placed apart. So if you are dealing with pheromone monitors, make sure you're reading the individual pheromone that you're using, because they will have different things to go off of, than another pheromone. Now, how would you place them and how would you use them? So this diagram I just kind of whipped up for this presentation. But we're going to say that you have a facility that you need to get pheromones in there. It has a warehouse portion, a processing portion, and then you have your offices or break rooms. So typically how I'd go about this is place it in a grid pattern. You know, if you place it in a grid pattern, then you can kind of already, triangulate where your problem is, kind of get a heat map in your head of if you get something, your activity going on in this X right here in this hanging pheromone, then you know you're in this, part of the warehouse. A lot of times you're gonna have a lot more than, just like 12 in a warehouse, depending on how big it is, but you can add pheromones or supplemental pheromones to try and triangulate it more. A lot of times what I would see out in the field is it's a packer right here, you know, um, was infested at one point, so we threw a pheromone monitor on that piece of equipment. There is a conveyor coming from down here that we once found bugs in. Now a pheromone monitor's in here. Now, after a few years, you have pheromone monitors just kind of scattered all over the place. Um, that's not necessarily the best way to do it. You can be a lot more efficient and effective, in a grid pattern. Um, in a warehouse, a lot of times I wouldn't use floor pheromones, just because a lot of your product on the ground level will be going in and out of warehouses all the time. If they have like some kind of wrapper or anything, then I put a floor pheromone around it. But hanging pheromones typically in a warehouse setting is a good thing to have. In your processing, uh, part of your facility, that's where your floor pheromones are really going to kick in. So that way you can attach it to equipment that's running 24/7, that's going to have product, constantly inside of it. Still want hanging pheromones. Kind of one of the purpose of this part right here is to show you that you're typically going to be putting about twice as many floor pheromones as your hanging pheromones. And that's just because your hanging pheromones are looking for stored product pests that fly, right? They're going to be able to go a lot further. And then your floor pheromones, I'd say are usually anywhere from 5 to 6 feet effective. That's about how far away your insects will be able to tell that it's there. So if you have a machine that's 10 feet apart, and you have one machine that's infested and another one that has a monitor on it, like you probably won't get them crossing paths because they won't even know it's there. But if it's hanging, then obviously, yes, that's going to happen. So this is, ILTs, you should have them in a lot of the facilities already that are prone to getting stored product pests. Maybe not in like your residential setting, or in some smaller commercial facilities. But your ILT, it's not necessarily a stored product pest equipment, but I like to just throw this up here just to try and give some credit to it. There are some benefits when it comes to stored product pests. It's great for easy identification and catching an issue early. And with the insects, like if one can fly and one doesn't, this can tell you a lot. There's a lot of different fungus feeding, like uh, your foreign grain beetle or your hairy fungus beetle. Those two get misidentified as stored product pests all the time. And both of them are highly attracted to light, and they're very good flyers. So if you have an ILT, they're going to overrun your ILT, and you'll be able to tell, right away, yeah, this can't be flower beetles. This must be a hairy fungus beetle because they fly and they're on my ILT. So this is just one thing to try and keep note, if you're dealing with stored product pests, or if you have a problem facility, this can help you, identify what's going on and try and find the hot spots. So last slide I got for you today. I'm not going to go too into each one of these treatment types because I could talk an hour on every single one if I wanted to. The first one is going to be what happens 99% of the time, and that's just tossing the product and sanitation. These issues are going to happen majority of the time in product itself. So if you're wanting to treat it, good luck. You're gonna have to mainly just toss it away. That product might be compromised from a moisture issue, which be the reason that attracted them in the first place, or that's more a cause, from them being there. There's a moisture issue, but tossing the product in sanitation, cleaning the area, that's going to be what happens 9 times out of 10. And it's going to be your least expensive option for your customer. Fumigation, jumping straight to your most expensive. It's going to be your clean slate treatment. If you have a worst case scenario, fumigation's probably going to be what you're going to want to try and shoot for. Uh, it's going to take, usually about 3 days to do it, and the plant will have to be shut down. And in those 3 days of the plant being shut down, they're going to be losing tons and tons of money, a lot more than what it would cost for a fumigation. And so because of that, and the labor, the money, all it takes for fumigation, a lot of companies can't do that. So they'll resort to fogging. That's going to be what you typically see, in these types of facilities is your fogging. It can be your most go-to type of treatment. Fogging a lot of times isn't going to kill your eggs, but you can, add the benefit of putting an IGR mixed into your fogging cylinder, like you see here in the picture, and you can apply your IGR as a surfactant treatment. So you have that option with your fogging versus like your fumigation. A lot of facilities that do have problems with stored product pests year round will have these type of treatments built in to their IPM plan. So they will have 2 fumigations a year, or they'll have 1 fogging every quarter, or they'll fumigate around the holidays when they are shut down, or vice versa, like your fogging. So a lot of those will kind of go in conjunction with each other. Insecticide applications, this isn't going to be something that's going to take care of your problem. As I mentioned before, your problem is going to be, in equipment or inside of product itself. So it's not like you can just take an insecticide and unload on that product. But what you can do is spray, like the feet of your equipment. You can spray like the shelving rack that it might be sitting on. These are all things that you can do to try and help limit the activity. And as I said before, with your insecticide applications, you're probably not going to be taking care of any major problems or any minor problems, but you can help limit it. Mating disruption, this one is still relatively new, and it's mainly seen just for Indian meal moths. Mating disruption, the idea of that is to pump so much of that sex pheromone into the air that the male just simply can't find a female and reproduce. Um, each one, like you've probably seen mating disruption in an account before. If you have an agriculture account, they do it all the time, just because they get returns in and out. And the only way to really, treat that is for mating disruption, just because you're not going to be able to fog or fumigate every time, returns come in. Each one of the little place packs that you use for mating disruption, and if this was a facility, you would have a ton of them. You'd have like, 50 to 100 different packs of them. So you use a lot. Each one of those packs is thousands of times more potent than your pheromone monitors. So it's a good thing to note if you have mating disruption out for, Indian meal moth or cigarette beetle, they're starting to come out with more of. But if you have, MD out, then you're probably not going to be catching anything on your pheromone monitors just because they simply won't find it. Lastly is heat treatment. I think this is the best treatment. Heat treatment. Not a lot of facilities have the capability to do that, just because you need big boilers inside these facilities to try and heat it up, heat the facility up to the temperature that you need, to kill all stages of your stored product pests. Takes a ton of time, a ton of energy, and a lot of heat to try and accomplish that. You can do heat treatments on specific equipment. I think this is excellent inside of food processing facilities because you won't need to shut down that part of the facility in order to treat it. You just get a little heat pod, heat the equipment up, kill the bugs inside, and you're good. If you're doing any kind of fogging treatment, I'd say try and pump up the heat as much as you can as well. The hotter it is, the more your insects will be breathing. So the more effective any of your treatments will be. So even if they have like just a small boiler room, try and crank the heat up. 10 degrees can make a big difference, and how well your fogging application would actually work. And if you have a 60-degree warehouse and you're fogging for it, well, that insect won't be breathing a lot, and a lot of times the insect can kind of like shut their body down a little bit to where they don't breathe, but they won't get affected by that fogging treatment. So, I mean, that's one thing to try and keep note. See, that's all I got for you right now. Say, I know I'd seen a question in there, so I'll go ahead and hop out of this.